Hi, just want to say a couple of things before we dive into this morning's passage from Genesis chapter 16. The first is that at the end of the month, at the end of June, we're coming to St. Peter's Day, which is our church birthday. And we always try and make a bit of a thing of this and make it a time when we celebrate what God is doing amongst us and through us as a church community and give thanks for that and just try and reflect in a positive way on all that God has given us as a church here at St. Peter's. And obviously that's going to be different this year because we're all in lockdown, but that doesn't mean we can't celebrate and be thankful. So we're looking for different ideas from you as to ways we can do that. If you have ideas of how we can make that weekend a little bit different, a little bit special in these strange circumstances in which we all find ourselves, then please do get in touch. Also, as I say each week, if you want to contribute a reading or some prayers or something else by video or by just audio track, then let me know and we'll put you in a rota and give you something to do. That'd be great. Also, if you have something you want to give thanks for, a bit of news you want to communicate to the church community, if there's something you'd like us to pray for as a church, then also please do get in touch and we'll include it in the messages and the service on a Sunday, as we would if we were gathering together in the church. We will include it in these services, even though we're physically separated. So we're continuing looking at the story of Abraham and using that to reflect on how we as individuals and as a church community will seek to be obedient to God in this time. How we will seek to discern what God wants us to take with us from how things used to be before lockdown into the future, and what we might think we need to be that's new and different in that future that at the moment feels uncertain, a little bit ill-defined. And we're using Abraham because he was a person who had that kind of experience. He was called by God to leave everything that he'd known, to go to a land that he'd never been to and didn't know the name of and didn't even know where it was, because God had promised him, and he had to make choices about what he took with him and what he would change and trust God for. So here we are today in Genesis chapter 16. And here we read about Sarai, Abraham's wife, and they still haven't had any children. And that is the essence of the promise that God has given Abraham and Sarai, that they will have children even in their extreme old age. And they are starting to really struggle with this. As we know, inheritance was extremely important in the culture of the day, and they had no sign of being able to pass on an inheritance to descendants they believed God had promised them, because they saw no sign of those descendants coming along. So Sarai looks around and she sees her Egyptian slave, Hagar, and she approaches Abram and says, "Look, I haven't had kids yet. Go and sleep with Hagar and have descendants through her." And Abram and Sarai agree to that. And Abram and Sarai agree to this course of action that seems like a total taking into their own hands of what God had promised them. And Hagar does indeed conceive, having slept with Abram. And Hagar, we read about in verse 4, knowing she was pregnant, starts to despise Sarai. This rupture in the relationship between them happens. And that then flips back into a rupture between Sarai and Abram. Abram has washed his hands of the matter. Verse 6, "Your slave is in your hands, do with her whatever you think is best." And we get this small throwaway phrase in verse 6, Sarai ill-treated Hagar. It probably means put her on the wrong end of favoritism, probably physically mistreated her, bullied her. So, unsurprisingly, Hagar runs away. But an angel of God finds Hagar near a spring in the desert and seeks her out and says, "Look, go back. You'll have descendants. And it's not all going to be easy for your descendants," the angel is honest with Hagar in that regard. But God sees you, says the angel in verse 30. God sees you. So Hagar bears Abram a son. Abram names that son Ishmael, and they are 86 years old at that point. Now, the first thing to say is that both Abram and Sarai are equally to blame for what happens. It's very easy to read this and say, because Sarai seems to be the one who first comes up with this idea, that it's all her fault. And certainly in some of the research I've been doing this week, a lot of people who have preached on this topic seem to land there, that Sarai is at fault. Now, the not so strange coincidence, it turns out, I think, is that most of the people who say that in their preaching are men, and men don't like to take the blame for things in my experience, and they say this is Sarai's fault. But Abraham could have said no. So Abraham didn't have to sleep with Hagar. They are both equally to blame. To be honest, if anything, more so Abram. It was him that actually did it. But anyway, both Abraham and Sarai are at fault. And the result of that is, as we said, is ruptures in relationships. The pressure starts to grow as the baby grows in Hagar's womb. Jealousy, perhaps, from Sarai to Hagar. A breakdown in a relationship such as it would have been between a slave and mistress anyway. And pressure between Abram and Sarai. Now, what Abram and Sarai are doing here is they are hurrying. They are not waiting on God. They are not trusting God. They are not believing that God is going to do what he has said and had promised that he would do, provide them with descendants even in their old age. So that they lose their patience. They come up with another plan and try to put that into action. Now, you see, hurrying is one of the fundamental problems of the human condition. Hurrying, losing patience, not trusting how things are meant to be, how God has ordered them, is one of the basic things that human beings like me and you get wrong. I was reading this week a book called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry by a minister called John Mark Comer. And he says, hurry kills relationships. Love takes time. Hurry doesn't have time. Abram and Sarai think time is running out, and they hurry God along. They hurry the plan along. And the result of hurry is relationships come under pressure. Relationships between spouses, with the slave, with whoever it is. I remember when I was at school, way back in the day, there were a couple of times where we went away for a week or a weekend to a place that our school used in the north of Scotland. And part of that is we would go on kind of walks in the hills, long walks in the hills, hikes. And we were always told in the groups we were in, go at the pace of the slowest person in the group. You'll be tempted to rush ahead, they said, because you'll want to get the walk done. But go at the pace of the slowest, because if one of you gets injured then on the walk, then it's important that you're with other people so the other people can help you. Don't hurry, don't lose patience. Go at the pace of the slowest, and everyone is safer. It's very tempting to hurry. But if we hurry, rather than go at the pace of the slowest, rather than take our time and trust God, and go at the pace that we need to go, if we don't do that, then relationships start to suffer. Relationships between family members, life partners, members of staff in the places we work, people we live amongst, people in church maybe even. We may think something is really important to us, so we're going to rush ahead and do it. And it's really easy to do that, especially if we're convinced that we are right and that everyone else needs to come along with us. But go slower and we've got a better chance of taking people with us, and relationships go under less pressure. Abraham and Sarai don't do that here. Enmity grows, as it does in the account we have of Eden, where enmity grows between Adam and Eve, and the relationship with God, of course, fundamentally suffers as well. But despite their awful treatment of Hagar, and it is Hagar here who really suffers, see how good God is towards her. God seeks her out, finds her by the spring in the desert, in the middle of nowhere where she thinks she's by herself. God, through an angel, seeks her out, restores her, heals her, says, I promise you, you'll have descendants. And he's honest with her. It's not all going to be easy for your descendants. We read about that in verses 11 and 12. But she knows that she is seen, she's in verse 13, and how significant that is. We are seen. Hagar is seen. And this is something we read about throughout the Bible, that God sees those who suffer at the hands of others, those who experience injustice and unfairness. God sees them. So often, people experience this suffering, this injustice, this unfairness, because they are not really seen by those who have power or privilege or authority. But God sees. God sees, is on the side of, is with, is for those who suffer, those who experience injustice, those who are mistreated and abused and overlooked. God sees them, seeks them out by the spring in the desert where they are hiding, where they are alone. And God draws close to them and makes promises to them and restores them. Part of the question I want to ask is, who is that now for us? Over the last couple of weeks, we've seen in the wider news that's going on around us how unseen violence against black people, particularly in America, but all over the world, is now being drawn attention to. And that seems to be a work of God, drawing attention to this violence to challenge us to be, as people, to be the ones who try to do something about it in God's power. Who is that for us as a church that is unseen in our church community, that we can with God see and be with and for? A lot of that maybe is about our ministry amongst those who are homeless. We have our Thursday night supper where we see each other on a level, without power, if at all possible, without status or privilege. We are all on the same level, and that's been taken up a level through the microsite over the course of this lockdown. Might there be more people in our community who are unseen in other ways? And who is that for you as individuals? Who in your life is not seen, that God is maybe wanting you to notice, who God is drawing to your attention? Who is it that we haven't seen in the past, that in the new reality that we're moving into as a church, in whatever our community looks like after lockdown? Who is it that we will see afresh that we haven't seen before? They say absence makes the heart grow fonder. I don't know if that's always true, but certainly not seeing each other over this period of lockdown will sharpen that sense of appreciation of each other when we do see each other eventually after lockdown. But who have we overlooked that the rest of society also overlooks, that we need to notice too? Could it be the abused? Could it be the addicts? Could it be whoever? A thought. I don't have an answer yet, but let's consider that before God. Going back to Genesis chapter 16, we are seeing here the huge danger of hurry, of taking things into our own hands, of this lack of patience that we can all fall into at rushing God's timing. Now, many of us will be familiar with that famous couple of verses from 2 Peter chapter 3, where Peter writes, "Do not forget this one thing, dear friends. With the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. Now, in the context that Peter's writing about there, that's Jesus' return. And he is saying, don't lose patience with Jesus apparently not coming back, with apparently God not keeping his promise for Jesus' return. Because God sees time differently to us. 1,000 years like a day, and a day is like 1,000 years. God is outside time and sees it all in one expanse in the same moment, in the same instance. So he's not slow in the way that we think of slowness. Jesus is coming, says Peter. And while that is specifically the topic that Peter is writing about, it applies to so many other things too. We get impatient with the things that don't change for us, or the things that don't change in wider society, or those that we love. But God is not losing patience with you. And when we rush things, as Abram and Sarai do here, there are all sorts of reasons we might want to rush that. We might rush things and try to bring things about through our own activity and busyness because we don't want others thinking that we're not as obedient to God, or God hasn't blessed us, or that we were wrong about God. We can make it want to look like something it isn't. Or we could just want to prove something to ourselves. Or it could be about us wanting to take the credit. It could be all sorts of things. But the effect of that ultimately is it ruptures relationships, as we saw. It ruptures our relationships with God and with other people. But going at the pace of the slowest, being patient, trusting God to work things out in his time, in his way, hard and sometimes painful as it is what makes his power known, and what enables others to see him through us and in us. And ultimately, it takes the pressure off us. It means we're not having to rush around doing stuff that we're not empowered or able to do. It means that our yoke is easy and our burden is light. The thing is that anything that's worthwhile, anything that's significant, and most importantly, anything that's going to last needs time. People need time to change if that's what they have to do. A group, a society, a community, whatever it is, needs time for change to really happen and take root. And there will be times when we, for ourselves or for another person or for a group or for a community, long for change and can see really clearly what the benefit of that change will be. And we'll want to rush it and do anything in our power to make it happen. But if we do that, we're stealing from God and from people, because the thing won't happen the way it's meant to happen. It won't be as lasting as it's meant to be lasting, and it won't be God that's doing it, so it won't ultimately last. And also impatience with God, lack of trust, hurry, is also about sometimes wanting to look successful in a variety of ways, like I mentioned just now, wanting people to know that we are blessed, wanting to know that we are holy, wanting to know that we were right about this issue, about this thing. But you see, the thing is, God doesn't reward success in that sense. God rewards faithfulness, and we do keep coming back to this. I do keep saying Jesus doesn't talk about God welcoming people into eternity in the new creation with the words, "Well done, my good and successful servant, enter into the rest I have prepared for you." Jesus doesn't say that, does he? What Jesus says God will say is, "Well done, my good and faithful servant, faithful servant, enter into the rest I have prepared for you." And faithfulness can only be about the long haul. Life, relationships with God and people is a marathon, not a sprint. It takes time, It takes patience and endurance, and that only comes from God. And with God, 1,000 years are like a day, and a day is like 1,000 years. He does not see time the way you and I do. He is not hurried the way you and I are. Hurry, as that quote I gave you earlier said, is a sickness. Elsewhere, that writer says, hurry is a form of violence on the soul. Patience is something that shows that God is at work in us. It's listed in Galatians 5 as one of the fruit of the Spirit, one of the signs that God's Spirit that's given at Pentecost that we marked last week is at work in us. There's that list in Galatians 5 that you'll know well: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness. Notice patience in there. Now we talk about love, joy and peace and some of those other things a lot. Patience is one of the less mentioned virtues, perhaps because it's one of the least found virtues in our current era. Patience, trust. I was told by one of the ministers who trained me for ministry that as a minister, and I think this applies to all of us who are disciples of Jesus, needs to learn the difference between the right idea and a good idea. And that can often just be about patience for the good idea to become the right idea, because that's about timing. We may feel that we need to get more exercise. Say for the moment you have decided that you need to get more exercise now. So you're going to start now. Now, actually, this is going to be a difficult season to do that in, isn't it? Because lockdown is not really, for most of us, a time when we're going to be able to get more exercise because we're in lockdown. So maybe we can think about it and plan for it, but only really be able to put that into action when the time comes that lockdown is finished. So it doesn't mean it's a bad idea to get more exercise, it's just not the right idea at the right time. So we can start to plan and think and prepare ourselves for the idea to really put it into action when we have the opportunity to do so. And that's about so many more things as well. It's a good idea to learn to drive, but you don't do it when you're 12 years old, you do it when you're ready to. A good idea is not necessarily the right idea. And so often the right idea, that difference between that right idea and that good idea is seen in discerning when the moment is for that good idea to happen and become the right idea at the right time, whether that's something we do as a church, whether that's something in our lives as individuals or as a community. Someone said there's nothing so powerful as an idea whose time has come. And that's about the sense that something has a moment, a kairos, as is the word that is used in the Bible, a God moment in history, which we can prepare our hearts for. And when God opens the door, when God empowers the opportunity through events and circumstances and provision and whatever else it might be, now is the moment. Then we act in his power. And what all this means is we need to learn to wait and to listen. We need to learn to wait and to listen. I've shared before during lockdown about how silence can be an important part of that. I'm trying to take every few hours just 2 minutes of silence to consciously be in God's presence and reflect on just 2 or 3 words of Scripture. And I would encourage you, if at all possible, to start doing that, because that's learning to be in God's presence, to wait on God, not for something, but just for the sake of who God is. We're well accustomed to praying for something, for waiting on God for something, and there's nothing wrong with doing that. God wants us to do that, and it's good to do that, to bring our requests and our needs to him. But there is also something special and significant about waiting on God, being with God, just for the sake of who he is, and in doing so acknowledging that he is God, and that because he sees time differently, because to him 1,000 years are like a day, and a day is like 1,000 years. We need to just wait and be patient in his presence and submit our plans and our purposes and our hopes and our dreams and everything else that we think and do and are to him. Waiting, being patient with God's apparent slowness that is not in reality slowness, is about submitting to God and trusting him. And so we do perhaps look at the future, look at what life after lockdown, life when this virus has become finally controlled or diminished altogether, when we have a vaccine and life can return to pretty much normal. We may look with anxiety at going back to how things were, or we might look with anxiety and think, what is it going to be? How will we survive? Because the economy is crashing and all this. And we'll want to hurry back to how things were, or hurry to make something new and different happen so everything's safe and okay and we can see that God's at work and whirring. But really what it's about is about putting us in control and making things how we want them. And that's very human. But that's what Abram and Sarai did here. And people suffer, actually, in the long run. When we do that, people suffer and our relationships suffer. But let's wait. Let's be patient together. Patient with each other. Patient with ourselves. Kind to each other. Kind to ourselves. And most of all, patient with God. For God is doing something that we cannot conceive of, that we cannot see. But he is at work, and he is doing something, and our job is to wait. And to when the moment comes and we discern it, we are ready to act in his power with the following wind of his Spirit to his glory. So, in the silence that follows, just take a couple of minutes to pray together or by yourself, asking yourself these questions. In what ways do I feel unseen by others, by the community, by society, whoever it is? And reflect on the fact that God sees you and seeks you out and draws close to you and does not overlook you and makes promises to you. Whom have we not seen that in the future God is leading us to see, to draw close to be the presence of God with these people, communities that are unseen to the rest of society? And finally, what can we do to live in this patience without hurrying God and ourselves and others? How can we draw into a mode of stillness and silence and rest and absence of hurry? Maybe against our so-called wisdom, which would seek to hurry and plan and activate and do. What does it look like for us to wait and to trust and to be patient? To train for the marathon, not the sprint. To wait for the good idea to become the right idea. To wait for God's timing, his perfect timing, to bring about what he has promised he will bring about. Let's begin thinking on those things together. Amen.